Oracle's new role at the top of the ERP throne, lessons from government ERP implementations, and how to conduct a digital transformation at no cost. Those are just a few of the topics we'll cover here in episode 220 of Transformation Ground Control.
Welcome to Transformation Ground Control. Ground Control. The podcast that covers everything related to digital transformation. This podcast features technology agnostic and international discussions related to digital strategy, software selection, implementation, change management, business process optimization, and everything else you need to know to make your digital transformation project successful. Whether you're embarking on an ERP implementation, supply chain transformation, or any other business or digital transformation, this podcast is for you. Now, here's your host, Eric Kimberling.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Ground control to Major Tom.
Hello, welcome to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 220. This is the podcast that covers everything related to digital transformation. It's a tech-agnostic view of the world of change, technology, and process improvement, digital strategy, all the stuff related to digital transformation. So thank you for being here today. My name is Eric Kimberling. I'm the CEO of Third Stage Consulting. We're an independent consulting firm that helps clients throughout the world reach their third stage of digital transformation success. And joining me, as always, is our co-host, Darian Chwialkowski. Darian, thanks for being here today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yep, exciting show and guest planned today. We're going to get into some social media questions to get started. We'll get into some newsworthy topics, including the headlines here. The two headlines we'll cover are, first of all, Oracle knocks SAP off the ERP throne. That'll be an interesting topic. And then IBM's AI agents are delivering $3.5 billion in productivity. So we'll get into a use case of how AI agents are actually delivering business value to at least some organizations. And then later in the show, we'll have our guest, our first guest, Ron Puccinelli, who is a government CIO who's recently named top 10 government CIOs in the United States. He's a two-time client of Third Stage Consulting. He's hired us twice now at two different organizations. And he's going to chat with us about lessons from government ERP implementations. And what I will say about that conversation, by the way, is yes, he is from the government. And yes, we're going to discuss government-specific case studies. But we've crafted the questions or framed the questions in a way that's going to be relevant to any organization in any sector going through digital transformation. So be sure to stick around for that. And then later in the show, in the last segment, we'll get into the $0 digital transformation. It may sound too good to be true, but we're going to talk about how organizations are potentially going through digital transformations without spending large sums of money on their projects. So we'll get to that later in the show. But before we do, what are some of the social media questions you've got queued up for us here today, Darian?
Yeah, some good social media questions. These both actually are from LinkedIn. This first one is the Harbaro case demonstrates the golden rule, which recognizes organizations to map capabilities before processes and then select technology. The capability-driven approach avoids the operational disruptions that you've described. The challenge is what strategies work best for shifting executive mindsets toward this sequence.
Yes. So that's in reference to some of the content I've published around Haribo, which is the gummy bear manufacturer. And they're a big global food manufacturing, food and candy manufacturer and distributor. And I did a case study about their, I think it was $500 or $600 million SAP implementation failure just a few years ago. And part of the problem they ran into is just the capability gaps between what SAP could do versus what they needed to do as an organization. And that really derailed the project and caused delays and overruns and all the stuff that becomes every CIO's nightmare, every executive team's nightmare when it happens. So I think mapping those capabilities up front and understanding what your needs are is super critical. And that's something that oftentimes gets overlooked. And too often organizations view technology as a sort of silver bullet that is going to solve all the problems and make life just so much easier without understanding or recognizing the gaps or the delta between what you need and what the software can do. And there's always going to be a tension there because no commercial off-the-shelf software is going to be able to do everything you need it to do. Especially these big ERP systems that were built for multiple industries and multiple scenarios. They just can't possibly capture every possible need that an organization might need. And so then the question becomes, well, which processes within our organization are we willing to forego and just say we're going to defer to how the software works, whether it's good, bad, or indifferent. But then there's other business processes that we say, no, actually we can't do that because it's a regulatory process or it's a source of competitive advantage or a differentiator for us. So we need the software to conform to what we do. And that tension and those decisions, that alone, just the decision making behind it can slow a project way down. So you want to make those decisions as early on as possible. Second of all, you just need to recognize the risks behind that, because there are risks for either direction you go. Some people would say, well, just don't customize the software and just conform to the way the software works and you'll be fine. That might be true from a technical perspective. It might make the technology deployment easier, but it's going to make it a lot more difficult from an operational and organizational perspective. So you haven't really fixed anything in that case. All you've really done is shifted the risk from one category to another. And so you can't assume that you got rid of the risk. You just made it a different risk, and now you've got to mitigate it. So you might end up having to spend more now on change management and operational process definition and all that stuff that takes time. So the key is to recognize the gaps between what you're deploying and what you need, identify the risks behind it, and have a strategy and a plan before you get into the implementation. Because if you wait till you're in the implementation, that's where things get derailed and slowed way down, and the meter's running, the costs spiral out of control because you're trying to make these decisions while the expensive technology consultants are out there designing and building stuff. They don't just stop billing because you haven't decided. You need a week to decide how you're going to run your operations in this one area. They're not just going to say, okay, we'll go away for a week and we'll stop billing. They're still billing you, whether they're being efficient or not. So I think that's the tricky part. So that's the key reason why all that upfront work is so important.
Yeah, absolutely. Some great points there. Our next question of the day is, well said, Eric. Many of our clients have faced similar experiences with other vendors. Often vendors initially aim to please, but when issues arise later, the blame shifts back to the client with lines like, it was your choice at the time. But if a customer knew everything, why would they need expert guidance? It's not a vendor's responsibility to guide the clients properly, set a clear roadmap, and sometimes even say no to certain requirements or suggest better alternatives rather than just focusing on the revenue.
You have to look at what vendors are good at and what they're not. You hire a vendor because, and when I say vendor, I don't just mean software vendor. I also mean system integrator, implementation partner, reseller, whatever, whoever the technical resources are affiliated with the software solution. Their job is to design and build that specific technology. And most of them are actually really good. I mean, I know I'm pretty hard on the vendor community at times, and I try to hold them accountable and whatnot. And the reality, though, is that most of them are not intentionally trying to screw up these projects. I mean, I think that's something that's important to understand is they mean well, and most of them do want to do what's best for the customer. So if the customer says, I want the software to do A, B, and C, and if the vendor is deploying a software that's flexible enough to do A, B, and C, they're going to do it for them. They're not necessarily going to say, does that make business sense? Or is that really something you should be doing? Now, what they should be doing is they should be saying, well, okay, you could customize over here, but that's risky. What if you did it this way? And you kind of look at the out of the box functionality and work through that. But as far as making a judgment call on whether or not it's a good business decision or if it's business best practice, that's not really what they know. I mean, they know their technology, they know how to deploy it. They can tell you all they want that they've got best practices and their software is the right way, but only you as a business can decide if that's true. I mean, they aren't in a position to be able to tell you that. They might try to tell you that, but they don't really know. So that's why a lot of clients hire us, is because we're sort of the liaison or the translator between technology and business. And because we're agnostic, we don't care if that technology is the right fit or not. We only care about the client being successful. And there are times where we say that software or that segment of that software isn't a good fit for that segment of your business. So, we help them navigate that decision of, okay, we can't just accept the software the way it is. We may not want to customize the software, or maybe we do. I don't know. I mean, that's part of what we walk them through. But then another option might be, well, maybe we look at a third-party bolt-on system that isn't from that same vendor. And that same vendor is not going to offer that to you because they're not going to sell you other people's software. us being independent, we don't care who you buy your software from, as long as it fits your business and makes sense. So that's the kind of decision making that we help our clients through, is just from a pure business perspective. How do you make those decisions and navigate that? But it's a great point, and it opens up a whole Pandora's box of a lot of challenges that a lot of these project teams have throughout the transformations.
Yeah, absolutely. And kind of switching gears here to get into our first newsworthy article of the day, we're going to talk about some software vendors, particularly Oracle and SAP. And the big news is that for the first time since the 1980s, SAP, according to this article, is no longer the number one ERP provider. Oracle has officially taken this top spot. Here's why. They hit $8.7 billion in ERP revenue in the last year, edging out SAP's $8.6 billion. Oracle's ERP customers are spending more on average, around $87,000 per customer compared to SAP's $61,000. And growth rates are telling kind of the bigger story overall, where Oracle grew 17.7% in the last year, while SAP only grew 13.7%. So while I guess it is a close race, it's a shift that hasn't been seen in a while here. And according to this article, they believe that Oracle's aggressive push into SaaS appears to really be paying off for them. The real question, I guess, out of this all is, will SAP start to catch up again, or are we witnessing kind of SAP starting their downfall here? So I'll kind of let you answer that before I get into any other questions here.
No, it's interesting. I know in the past, Oracle has a bit more of a diversified business than SAP. They've got the database side and other infrastructure type services that they sell beyond core ERP. And I think there's a kind of a gray area in some of those numbers. And I haven't seen these numbers that you're referring to, so I don't know if this is true or not. I'm just speaking from the past. But historically, they have sort of tried to, spin the numbers a certain way to show that they're better than SAP. But I know in numbers in the past, when you dig into it, it's not really. I mean, they're a behemoth for sure. Don't get me wrong. They are, one of the big, massive ERP vendors. But whether or not they're bigger than SAP, I don't know. That surprises me a little bit, because we just see a lot more SAP customers out there in general. But that could be just bias in our sample or our client sample. So honestly, I don't know that it matters really. I mean, they're both massive tech companies. The fact that it's close, I suppose, even if they're not technically ahead of SAP, the fact that it's close might suggest that there's something going on with SAP. I think strategically, SAP is making some pretty poor decisions that are going to haunt them in the future, and I think it's going to hurt them. And I think I really do think they'll become obsolete in the future. I think they're the next Bond. When I think of Bond software, which I have all the respect in the world for the guy that started Bond software, but he built that at a time where things changed. It was in the 90s, and then by the early to mid 2000s, it started to decline, because the technology, after he sold the company, they just didn't keep the technology up with the changing market. And I think SAP is doing that right now. They're sort of stuck on this monolithic ERP model, and they're stiff arming their customers into upgrades. They're chewing up a lot of money of their clients, and it's delivering questionable business value. So I don't know. I think the model itself is dying. Oracle is probably better suited to navigate some of those changes and evolutions, because they have so many different products and solutions that they own. I think they can sort of move away from that monolithic ERP model a little bit easier than SAP. But we'll have to see if I'm right or not. Give me 5 to 10 years and we'll know if I'm right or wrong.
Yeah, that's fair. Kind of a question that is a bit different than what the article is talking about. But if a customer is choosing between Oracle and SAP, what is something that they should think about when choosing between those two softwares that are giants, like you said?
Yeah, I think with Oracle, you have to think about what you're really getting. When you say Oracle, what software am I getting? They have so many different solutions with Fusion, and, they used to have EBS, e-Business Suite, or EBS was the acronym. They also owned, or still own technically, PeopleSoft and JD Edwards and some of these other Siebel, some of these sort of best of breed ERP and CRM solutions. So you have to, they've taken some of these capabilities and tried to build it all into Fusion now. And so, but they still have EPM on the performance management side. They have their HCM, their HR applications. So they do have a lot of different systems. You just have to know, on one hand, the positive is that you have more to choose from with Oracle, but on the flip side, you have to know exactly what you're getting and what you need from Oracle because they have so many different things. So I think it could be a more flexible model. It could be more of a best of breed fit for you. Whereas SAP historically has had more of an integrated solution that is one application, which could be good or bad depending on what your needs are. I will say that SAP is sort of, I think they've acknowledged that they can't satisfy the needs of all their ERP customers because they've gone out and acquired Ariba and SuccessFactors, Business Objects, Concur, all these different applications that are sort of best of breed solutions. They've gone out and acquired them, and now they offer those solutions as sort of a bolt-on to S4HANA. So I think that's their acknowledgement, perhaps, that S4HANA is not the silver bullet answer to the mass ERP market, and they need these other solutions to plug the holes. So anyway, so that's, in my opinion, that's sort of diminished their value historically, which was the more integrated ERP solution model, and now it's becoming a little bit more of a best of breed, which, back to my point about Oracle, that could be a advantage. So I think you just have to really understand what you're getting, what the needs are, which one's going to give you more flexibility. I think in general, you're going to get a bit more flexibility with Oracle, whereas SAP is going to be more suitable for a big global company that's trying to standardize their operations. That's more kind of like the SAP S4HANA sweet spot. So you have to look at some of those intangibles, and then of course all the tangible requirements definition that you would do for any software evaluation. So we actually have a software selection guide on our website you can download for that. So we'll have to include a link to that in this podcast episode, but it's a guide to software selection that'll help you navigate decisions around SAP versus Oracle or any other system you might be evaluating as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Switching to our next newsworthy article of the day. This one is a major AI story, I guess you could say. Every week I feel like there's a new major AI story, but this one is IBM just reported a 3.5 billion productivity gain over the past 2 years thanks to their internal use of AI agents. They called this their client zero strategy, meaning they tested and refined their AI tools internally before rolling them out to customers. And they say their results are pretty eye-opening. So AI agents were embedded into 70 plus business areas from HR to IT to finance. One agent, Ask HR, now handles 94% of routine HR tasks automatically. Another, Ask IT, reduced its IT support requests by 70%. All of it was powered by Watson X Orchestrate, which coordinates the AI agents across different departments. The big takeaway here was that IBM isn't just using AI for automation. They're creating an interconnected network of AI agents that can collaborate, perform tasks independently, and help employees work smarter and not harder. Now, the question is, can other companies replicate this success, or is it something only a giant company like IBM with resources and with the resources and infrastructure they have can pull off?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the good news is I don't think it's a resource or budget issue to be able to leverage these AI agents. It's kind of interesting because it's as disruptive as AI is and can be, to technology in general. AI has been extremely disruptive to technology. It feels like AI is not going to be as disruptive to business users, and I don't mean it's not going to be disruptive like help them. I just mean there's not as much risk with AI. There are risks for sure, but when you think about using AI agents, for example, instead of versus implementing a new ERP system where you've got to rip out all your back office systems and migrate all that data and get everyone comfortable with a brand new system, AI sort of is a little bit more stealth, I guess you could say. Like in an organization, you can get more stealth value out of it, where you could deploy AI agents like IBM has without necessarily having to go spend tens or hundreds of millions of dollars implementing new technology like you would with an ERP system. So I think if anything, it's actually giving smaller and mid-sized companies a bit more of a level playing field now. Now, I will say that IBM, probably being a tech company, is going to be more innovative and more technology forward. So they're probably just going to adapt to new technologies better. And they, being a big behemoth like they are, they've got more resources to focus on trying to deploy some of these AI agents to get those kind of benefits that you talked about. But it's not, the good news is not like a financial thing. It's not like a financial obstacle for a lesser company or smaller company to deploy that same technology. They just have to figure out how they want to use it. I think that's the bigger barrier, is like, okay, let's deploy a bunch of AI agents in our organization. What does that mean? Like, what, how, where, what are they going to do? What, all that stuff, and that clarity and definition has to happen at some point. Even if you want to experiment, that's okay. But at some point you've got to experiment and say, okay, this is working. This isn't. Let's take the one that's working and scale it across the company. And let's ignore the stuff that's not working. It's a distraction. It's not adding value. So let's not focus on that. So there's a lot of experimentation that needs to happen within an organization. But once you find something that works, you can start to scale it at speed, a lot faster than you could do like a normal enterprise tech project.
Yeah, absolutely. One question to kind of go with that: how can companies avoid overwhelming their employees as they start to integrate more AI into daily workflows?
It's a good question. I think first of all, you have to take away the fear of AI. If you can take that away to where it's like, hey, we want you to use this tool not as a replacement to you, but almost like your own personal assistant. Like this person being the AI agent is here to help you, and it's free. Well, not free, but we're not having to hire a new body, but it's just someone that's there to help you. So I think take the disarming nature of it, or the disarming activity is important. And then also just giving clarity, of like looking like you would with any sort of enterprise tech project. You would look at requirements, you look at your current state processes, you look at pain points, you define some requirements. You do the same thing for AI. You just look at maybe from a different lens of like, well, what if you didn't have to do that manual process? Or what if we used an AI agent to go look up that information for you instead of you having to manually do it all the time yourself? How much more work could you do if you had that sort of help, and sort of working through the solution with the employees and helping identify how they can translate their pain points, their inefficiencies, their manual processes into something that an AI agent could help with, that, and making them part of that solution. I think all that is going to be really important to get the benefit and mitigate any sort of resistance or fear of change.
Yeah, absolutely. It's definitely interesting, especially because they are such a big company. I guess in your take, for mid-sized companies or smaller companies, to build this network of AI agents, what is the proper way to kind of start building it in the company?
Yeah, I mean, the first step, like I said, is to define what you want the AI agent to do. And so I'd say starting with your current process and understanding your pain points and really identifying those opportunities within any given micro workflow or any person's job, defining where AI could potentially help them. And so that's where it gets back to, looking for things like spreadsheets. Anytime I'm manipulating data in a spreadsheet, or if I'm manually looking up information, that those are high potential areas for AI agents. And so just looking at your current state, understanding where those opportunities might be, and then testing out the AI agent to see, if we take Darian's job and we sit down with her, even though there's 100 people doing what Darian does, I'm going to use Darian as sort of a test person, and we're going to define her process and how an AI agent might work, and then fine tune it. And then once we find something that works, then we can roll it out to the other 100 people that are doing Darian's same job. So that's what I would do to get started. And I would also look for high volume transactional areas. Anything that involves high volumes of transactions or high volumes of information, that's a perfect use case for AI. So I'd look for manual processes, inefficiencies, looking for information, disparate data, high volumes of data. Those are sort of the, not warning signs, but the opportunity signs, I guess you call it, for where AI might be able to help.
Yeah, absolutely. That makes sense. But I'm excited to kind of get into this conversation with Ron today.
Yeah, should be a great conversation. I'm really looking forward to it. He's a repeat client of ours at Third Stage Consulting. He's hired us twice now at two different organizations. One was with the city of Fairfield. The other was with city of Menifee. And in both cases, we went through an ERP evaluation and selection, and then we helped them through the implementations in both cases. And I wanted to have him on the show as a first-time guest to talk about some of the lessons learned from his experience as a government CIO leading ERP implementations. But if you're not in the government or public sector space, fear not. You will get lots of lessons, plenty of lessons that apply to any industry. It just so happens that he's in government, but I'd say 80, 90% or more of the lessons we'll talk about is going to apply to any sort of industry. So we're going to bring him on the show here in just a moment. And then later in the show, we'll talk about the zero-cost digital transformation and whether or not that's a reality or a possibility. So got a lot more to cover. We're going to take a quick break. We'll be back with more Transformation Ground Control.
I'll give you anything to feel it coming. Do you wake up on your own? I wonder where...
I'm excited to announce the release of our 2025 Digital Transformation Report. It's available now on the Third Stage Consulting website, www.thirdstage-consulting.com. This report gives you an unbiased, technology-agnostic insight to help you optimize your organization's projects for success. Get your copy today using the QR code in front of me or on our website.
Are you looking for ways to promote your product or service to enterprise technology decision makers and influencers throughout the world, like the ones who listen to this podcast? Major Tom Productions creates media, events, and influencer marketing for B2B technology providers. Our productions are exciting, educational, disruptive, and effective. Most importantly, they create results. Our content is unlike any other in this industry, engaging, influential, and trusted by technology buyers and influencers throughout the world. Each month, our productions reach hundreds of thousands of targeted buyers and decision makers who trust and engage with our honest and tech-agnostic content. With long-tail viral results and engagement with our content, Major Tom Productions provides a way to reach your target market and create awareness, calls to action, and a connection with potential customers. So collaborate with us today. Learn how we can feature your product or service on podcasts such as Transformation Ground Control, Journey to S/4HANA, and Journey to Dynamics 365. We can also feature your brand on our YouTube channel called Digital Transformation with Eric Kimberling, which boasts over 100,000 subscribers and over 2 million video views per year. You can also participate in our in-person events, including our Digital Stratosphere Conference. Contact us today to learn more. We can tailor a marketing campaign that works for you. We look forward to helping more people learn more about and become engaged with your brand.
And I'll do anything you ever dreamed to be complete. Little pieces of nothing that fall.
Hello and welcome back to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 220. My name is Eric Kimberling here at Darian and Chwialkowski. You can find new episodes of this show every Wednesday at transformationgroundcontrol.com. The show is sponsored by Third Stage Consulting, which is an independent and tech-agnostic consulting firm that helps clients throughout the world with their digital transformation journeys. And the show is produced by Major Tom Productions. If you'd like to collaborate with us on this podcast and other content produced by Major Tom, I've included contact information below that you can reach out to us to discuss that. So I'm excited for our next guest, first-time guest on the show. We've done 220 episodes of the show, and this is the first time we've had him. So better late than never, but glad to have him. He's a repeat client of ours here at Third Stage Consulting. He's hired us twice at two different city organizations, and we've been involved in their ERP implementation in both cases. So I wanted to have him on the show to talk about some of the lessons from having done multiple government ERP implementations, as well as private sector implementations as well. So he's a unique person in that he's worked both in the private and the public sector spaces. So a lot of lessons, regardless of what industry you're in. But with all that being said, I want to introduce our guest, Ron Puccinelli. Ron, thanks for being here today.
Thank you, Eric. Great to join you.
Thanks for being part of this. I've known you for several years now. You've been a repeat client of ours at Third Stage, and yet we've never done a podcast interview until now. So I suppose it's better late than never, but I feel like it's overdue that we had this conversation. So thanks for being here today. For those that don't know you, tell us a little bit about yourself and sort of just your background and what you do.
Sure, thank you. So my background, I've been doing IT as a CIO for over 20 years, both public and private sector. So I'll be drawing on both of those experiences as I'm answering your questions. Uh, Most recently with City of Fairfield in Southern California in the Los Angeles Riverside County area. Um, Prior to that, up in the San Francisco Bay Area, where I'm currently at, if you can't tell by my background. Been doing this for a while. ERP is one of those interesting things where kind of like once you touch it, you become, that's all you can do. But there are many lessons that you can take from an ERP or other kind of digital transformation and apply to almost any other type of large scale IT project. And I'll try and draw some of those parallels for you as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a great point, that everything we talk about today and the questions that we've come up with to talk about here today, and hopefully even the audience questions, it's, yes, we're going to focus on your background experience with government IT and government transformations, but so much of this stuff is cross industry and lessons that can be applied across the board. So it's a great point. Now, how did you get, you've straddled between public sector and private sector. You've done both. How did you end up in getting involved with ERP implementations in government entities?
Well, I started off in the private sector in the more traditional business world, being around ERPs, doing ERPs there. During the whole .com experience, if any of the audience can remember that far back, that was one of my bigger tasks, was doing those for several startups. And then that just transitioned into when the government space started catching up and saying, oh, we need to update our financial systems. We want to do ERP. Well, I've done those. So guess what? You get to do it again. A lot of the lessons cross. There are some unique nuances, but they're not showstoppers. So it really is interesting how, regardless of what industry you're in, what public or private or anything like that, the lessons, the work remains the same. A computer's a computer. It doesn't know what it's doing.
Right. And you need humans to tell it what it should be doing. And
absolutely.
We'll get into a lot of that here in a second as it relates to more the human component of it. So how does implementing an ERP system in government differ, though? I know you're saying a computer's a computer. You need to, it doesn't know what to do. You need the human element to deploy it. And so much of what we're going to talk about today has, I don't want to say has nothing to do with government, but it's sort of like these are universal principles in many ways. But in general, setting that aside for a moment, how are government ERP implementations different? And what are some of the biggest challenges you've seen in the public sector versus the private sector?
Sure. I think there are three main areas where there is some difference. First of those obviously starts at the beginning of the process, the procurement cycle. In government, by definition, we have to be a lot more rigorous because we're spending taxpayer money, not our own money. So that process tends to be a little bit lengthier, tends to be a little bit more detailed. I wish I could tell you it's always been better, but not always. It really comes down to, you want to make sure that you're putting in your request for proposal or your solicitation, or even just when you're asking a vendor, if you're on the private side, you want to make sure that they're looking at and focusing on the way you and your business work, not so much on here's what our system does. You want to make them respond to and demonstrate how they can support your business, your unique value add to your processes. On the implementation side, on the government side of space, we follow a concept called fund accounting. You might run into this in the nonprofit space a little bit as well. Kind of correlates also to grants. But in that sense, it's from the private side of the world, it would be like a separate company. Each fund would be its own company, and you're not allowed to mix funds and things like that across. So making sure that your system can support the principles and concepts of fund accounting. That's where a lot of folks will tend to focus on an ERP system that's more crafted, more aimed at the government market space. But you can use, and I've actually done 2 or 3 of these, you can use a private sector specific product, ERP product, to do fund accounting. You just have to work within the constraints of what it has. And I think lastly, the biggest difference is how fast the rate of change, the rate of absorption in your organization. And that's always a tricky balance. You don't want to push something through so fast that people can't adjust to it. And you definitely do not want to leave the people out of it. The people are going to be using the system, both, the heads down HR, finance kinds of folks, as well as the more casual other departments, who they need to use it, but they don't need to know every little detail about how everything works. You want to make sure that you're implementing at a pace that they can absorb, they can adjust, and also that works the way they like to work, the way, as much as you can, the way they think about how things work. So I think those are probably the 3 biggest things. And in the government side of space, on that last people one, there's a lot more attention that needs to be paid to how are we getting our teams ready for this. In the private sector, it's easy for the CEO or somebody to get up and say, this is what we're doing, questions, great, but we're still doing it. It's not always that straightforward in the government space. Again, because we're spending other people's money, because we have to answer for how we're using taxpayer money, we have to be a little bit more thorough, a little bit more diligent in that process.
Yeah, and you have so many different stakeholders you're answering to, and there's political forces,
Very much so.
public perception forces, all of these sorts of things that the private sector just doesn't have to deal with. And I imagine that it's just going to slow things down, right? I mean, you're just not going to be able to make the command and control decisions faster, like a private sector in theory could, even though I would argue a lot of private sector organizations have the same problem, but for different reasons. But that is a big challenge, I imagine.
It can be a challenge, yes.
I'm gonna pull on a couple threads that you just mentioned, because you hit some really good points there. But first, I want to turn to the audience real quickly, just to say hello to some people that are chiming in here on the various platforms. Thanks everyone for joining here today, and wherever you're joining from, if you don't mind, just drop in the chat any questions you have along the way, anything that comes to mind, or any comments you have. Try to make this as engaging as possible. You talked about fund accounting and how that's different than the private sector. And I guess that sort of touches on an even bigger question or issue, which is the whole concept of understanding what's unique about your industry or your organization that you can't change, or you shouldn't change, you don't want to change. And I don't mean it like we're resistant to change sort of thing, but more, this is just who we are, and this is our industry. Or in the private sector, it might be, this is our competitive advantage. And not every off-the-shelf software is going to be able to do what you said. So how did you, in the case of fund accounting, how did you navigate that and other nuances that are somewhat unique to government? And how did that affect your transformation?
Sure. Let me just briefly touch on what I mean by fund accounting, make sure we're starting on the same page, essentially. So in fund accounting, in government space, we have things like a general fund, which is unrestricted use. You can use that money for anything you want. Then you've got things like gas tax, which can only be used for streets and transportation kinds of things. And you've got other restricted funding sources that can only be used for those particular things. That's what I mean by fund accounting. Right. So that all goes back to, in the beginning, when you're doing your selection process, your solicitation process, you want to clearly identify what are those kinds of requirements. In the case of government space, fund accounting is not optional. It's legally required. We can't change it even if we wanted to. It's just the way the law says we have to do things. So it's not optional. As much as I like working for government and doing these projects, I'm not going to go to jail for doing one of them.
Right.
But and that's, again, where it gets back to, you want to make sure that you're requiring the vendors proposing for your system, make sure that they're addressing those specific needs that are unique, that are your value add, or that are your specific industry and legal requirements. Don't let them just say, hey, we got all these bells and whistles. Isn't this cool? Well, yeah, that's cool. But how do you do these things that we really, really need to make sure we have it
Yeah.
done? As I mentioned, some of the, like the SAPs or the Oracle systems or any of the other more private sector focused systems, they can do fund accounting. They just happen to call it a separate company. The concepts are the same. In company A, they have their revenue, they have their expenses, etc. Company B has its, and they don't mix. That's
Right.
fund accounting. It's just in the context of the system, they call it a company. That can be difficult for government folks to wrap their head around, but it's not
Right.
insurmountable.
Right. Yeah, and a lot of those nuances are things that can create risk and delays and uncertainty in a project, and that's the stuff you really have to dig into and understand, and not gloss over or treat like every other business requirement you might have. Because, like you said, you don't want to go to jail, and because there's
Yeah.
certain things you have to do from a regulatory perspective, and you have no choice. And so it's not enough for the
Yep.
software vendor to say, well, we have best practices built into our software. Well, no, you don't. If I'm going to go to jail because your software doesn't do what I need it to, then that's not best practice. And same with the private sector too. There's going to be core competitive advantages that certain organizations have that the software can't do. And so that stuff, or that tension between what you need and what the software can do, first of all, you're never going to have a full alignment, 100% fit. So that small percentage of the small
Right.
exceptions that don't fit, that's what causes delays and sometimes overruns on these projects. Have you seen that before, where like that where you get hung up on the
Oh yeah.
project?
Very, very much so, particularly in the private sector, in the several I've done over there. And you made a really interesting point there, Eric, where um, you want to make sure that you're not going to get 100% of everything you want out of a particular system, but make sure that your unique value add, whether you're in government or in the private sector, make sure that those things are included in the capabilities of the system. You don't want to change your business, give up your value proposition in order to implement an ERP system, because then you're not any different or any more valuable than any other of your competitors.
Yeah, definitely. Here's an interesting question or comment that I'm curious to hear what you think of this, Ron. This is from Carmen on LinkedIn. Hello, Carmen. Carmen says, then we have to take into account cybersecurity and FDIC regulations and regulatory technology. So,
Yes.
what are your thoughts on that comment?
Yeah. Today, cybersecurity is not something you can do as an afterthought. You really need to build that in. I would suggest baking it into your solicitation process. You want to understand, if you're going with a cloud-based solution, which most of them are anymore, what are they going to do when they notice an issue? Will they tell you about it? Most vendors will try to not tell you about it. My own personal opinion on this is I want to know when something's affecting a system for which I and my organization are responsible. We've had some long discussions with various legal teams about that. Finally, we were able to get it in there. You also want to make sure that you understand who is responsible for handling the security. Is it the vendor? Is it you? Is it a partnership? Now, if you're going with a cloud-based solution, more than likely they will handle the back-end security for the hardware, the actual software, things like that. But it's still on you to make sure that permissions are correct, that user accounts are handled correctly, all of those kinds of things. But at the end of the day, you still want to make sure that it's clear who does what and what obligations each has to the other in terms of notifications and things like that. One of the things that is helpful is to make sure that you're getting their SOC audit report results, their letters from their SOC auditors. SOC type 1, type 2, type 1 being the moment in time, type 2 being their process over the review period. Those kinds of things will help you understand if they're being as thorough and diligent as they can be. And it also helps you with your cyber insurance, with your risk management on your side, to understand where your risk is and how much risk you're taking on when you agree to go with one of these systems. In terms of FDIC or any of the other regulatory requirements, and I've had to deal with FDIC, with FDA, with Food and Drug Administration, and several others. You definitely want to make sure that you understand what each of those bodies requires from you, and make sure that that's built into your reporting, into your organization, into your chart of accounts if necessary. And at the end, you also want to take into account the audit process. Are you doing an annual audit? In the government side of the space, we have to do something called an annual consolidated financial report, ACFR. That's where you roll everything up together and present it as a public document and say, across the fiscal year, this is how we spent the taxpayers' money. Some systems do that creation really well, some don't. You want to make sure you understand how that's going to work. You also want to make sure things like auditors, is there a way to have a specific audit type of account that has visibility but can't make changes in your system, as opposed to giving them full sysadmin rights to your system? So those kinds of nuances. And again, that doesn't matter whether you're on private or public. It's just things you need to pay attention to in your system.
Yeah, and you hit a few good points. In one in particular is that when you think of cybersecurity, oftentimes we think about hackers, getting into our network from the outside, and that obviously is a big threat. That's an increasing threat for public sector and private sector organizations. But there's also you sort of talk about admin security rights, just your own internal employees and what kind of information or what sort of access they have, because there's a lot of non-criminal, non-nefarious types of security issues as well. Someone just doesn't understand, realize
Absolutely.
that they have access to something they shouldn't, or they somehow corrupt data they shouldn't be touching, that sort of thing. So there's more subtle, less criminal types of cybersecurity issues that are arguably just as important too, that you've got to think about. Not just are the hackers going to bust into our system or not?
Right. The internal threat, the employee, either intentional or unintentional, is perhaps even a bigger
Yeah.
threat.
Yeah. Good point. And just as a follow-up to that, Carmen had a follow-up here, or just a follow-up comment, I suppose it is. So Carmen said, as a follow-up to her question, also very important as someone who understands risk management, fraud prevention, understanding regulatory technology is key.
Absolutely.
So can't
Yeah.
forget about regulatory stuff, cybersecurity, fraud prevention, all that stuff may not be as sexy and cool as some of the other enterprise technology stuff we talk about, but it is something that has to be done as part of this. So
Absolutely true.
here's a really interesting question from Jeremy on LinkedIn. It looks like he's on LinkedIn. So Jeremy says the sponsor is a key role in any ERP implementation. And I'd say in the private sector, just to add to that, in the private sector, oftentimes you have the CFO or maybe the COO, sometimes the CIO, someone at that level, ideally from the business, though, someone who's more on the business operations side that can be involved is typically the sponsor. But from what role does a good government implementation sponsor come from? In other words, what are the typical sponsors or leaders within a government ERP implementation?
Excellent point. In my opinion, and I'm basing this on research and several years of experience, as well as Gartner Group and others talking about these kinds of things, there really are no technology projects. They're all business projects that rely on technology to get where they're going. From that perspective, personally, I believe you need to make sure that your sponsor is the CEO, the COO, the city manager, the assistant city manager, and maybe not. It could be the finance chief financial officer. It really should not be the CIO, the technical person. The last thing, I shouldn't say it that way. The one thing I want to try and avoid is IT said this is how we're going to do it. No, this is how the business needs to work. I need finance to tell me how they want their process to run. I need human resources to tell me how they want their processes to run. We all roll up and we all report up to somewhere there's a chief executive. That person needs to have bought into the need for the project, be supportive of executing the project, because without that support, it's easy for everybody to say, oh, well, this is just those people doing the things they want to do. It's not really important from an overall organization perspective. And that's where that sponsor is the super critical, in my opinion. You want to make sure that you've got the organizational gravitas, that top one or top two person behind you, saying, yes, this is an important project. This is why it's important to us, and this is what we're doing. Doesn't mean you can't be feeding them all the information, ghostwriting essentially what's going on, but you need their clout in the organization, their weight in the organization behind you to make that work. And that's true in government, probably more true in government than any other of the businesses I've been in.
Yeah. Yeah. You need someone from the business side to be the face of the change. And you made an interesting comment that, I think every, or not every CIO, but I know a lot of CIOs, it sounds like maybe yourself included, where one of their biggest nightmares is, well, the CIO or IT said that we have to do it this way. And that is the last thing you want. Now, of course, technology has limitations, and there's certain, IT can't deliver everything that the business wants.
Right.
And so there might be limitations to what IT can deliver, but you shouldn't have IT defining how you're going to run your business and that sort of thing.
Right. We're not the business people. We're never going to know it as well as the people who do it all day, every day. And again, I don't want to be stuck in a position where, well, we can't do that line of business, or we can't run that mission critical process because IT won't let us. It's like, okay.
Yeah. That's interesting. Well, and just as a side note, a couple side notes I want to share here as we get to more questions from the audience. First of all, we're talking about a lot of lessons here from ERP projects. We actually have an ebook that's a good supplement to this discussion called Lessons from 1,000 ERP Implementations. We've taken and compiled our team's several hundred, over 1,000 different ERP implementation lessons and compiled it into an ebook. So you can scan this QR code right here on our screen for those that are watching this versus listening. And if you're listening, we'll also include a link in the chat or the notes below. But just scan that QR code that I'll leave up here for a second. You can download our guide to 1,000 ERP or lessons from 1,000 ERP implementations. Secondly, another sort of fun fact is you are actually in the market looking for a new CIO role. So if anyone out there is looking for a CIO or knows someone who's looking for a CIO, either in the public sector or on the private sector side, Ron's a good guy. He's been a client of ours 2 different times now. So we'd love to get the word out that he's available for hire. So be sure to connect with Ron on LinkedIn if you're not already. And we've tagged him in this post too. So go to LinkedIn, you'll find his profile there. You can connect with him. But I want to get to another comment here that this is from Darian on LinkedIn. And the question here from Darian is, you mentioned public sector projects inherently moving slower than private sector ones. What are some best practices you've seen that have helped governments overcome those delays even slightly? It's a really good question. And how might that be different? I'll add another layer to that. What do you do to help overcome some of those delays? And how does that differ from how you might address the same issue when you were in the private sector?
Thank you. That's a great question. I would push back just a little bit. I'd say they don't necessarily have to run slower than they do in the private sector. The biggest challenge is just making sure you're really clear on what the steps are you need to follow. And there are a few more steps, particularly in the procurement side, for those of us doing things in the government space. But if you know what those steps are, once you know what those steps are, you can build them into your project plan so that it's not really slowing down your project plan. It's just things you have to do, just like any other step in the project. Make sure you get it done on time, within your time budget. I think there are things you can do, such as paying attention to things like organizational change management. If you can get in front of that, that will pay back huge dividends in terms of lowering the organizational resistance to changing business processes. It will smooth out the adoption curves. It will give you a quicker ramp up to full utilization of a major investment for most organizations. These are not cheap systems to do. But by doing that, now you can get the questions from the people who are actually going to be hands on the keyboard entering data into the system. You can get their questions, their concerns quicker through the organizational change management process. incorporate that into your training efforts prior to go live and post go live. You can address any questions during the project so that they don't come up to the day before go live. It's like, I don't know what I'm doing. I don't like this. I don't like that. Build that into your process so that you don't end up in those kinds of situations. It really just comes down to, I think, understanding the steps that are different that you have to do, building those into your project plan, and then staying as connected to the organization as you can and understanding where they are, for lack of a better word, mentally are they ready? Are they worried? Are they, where are they in their process of adopting this change? Because at the end of the day, if you're dealing with people, money, or assets for your organization, you're going to be touched by an ERP system, even if all you do is get a paycheck. That's a pretty important thing for most of us. But you want to make sure that process is not overly complex and overly stress-inducing, for lack of a better way of saying it, to the whole organization.
Yeah. That's a great point. And here's a comment from Paul on LinkedIn. Paul says, IT said this is how we should do it, quote unquote, is spot on. The business case needs of each work group needs to be addressed in ERP planning and rollout. They are the customers. This is especially true in government. So great.
Absolutely true. It's not a lot less important in the private sector, but it's very, very true in the government space. And that's why with ERP projects and even other large scale tech-enabled projects that I work with, I partner with my internal clients, departments, 1, 2, whatever the number is, so that when we're pitching it, when we're reporting on our progress to the decision makers, to the constituents, to whomever it might be, my business partners are saying, this is the value we're getting out of it. I'm there saying, this is where we are in the implementation and the technology side of it. Because at the end of the day, if all you're doing is looking at the technology side of a project, you're never going to find the value. All you find is the expense and the cost. It's just the nature of what we do. But we want to make sure we have the other side of that, the business value of, and our business department saying, we see value in this. This is the value we're getting out of it, and communicating that out together as the team.
Yeah. Now, one comment that came up in, I think it was Paul, right? Was that his name? Sorry. Yes, Paul. So Paul, in his comment, alluded to business case, which is kind of an interesting comment or thought when it comes to public sector organizations. In the private sector, when you do a business case, there's labor efficiencies you're going to gain. You can increase revenue. You can reduce your inventory. If you're a manufacturer, you can speed up your manufacturing time. There's all these pretty clear, tangible business case benefits line items that are not always guaranteed, but they're easier to identify in some cases. What does a business case look like in the public sector? How is it different? Is it financially quantifiable in the same way? Do you see the same type of ROI that you might see in the private sector, or what are your thoughts there?
From the labor perspective, from the business efficiency side of things, it's very, very similar. You're going to save X amount of time in this process, X amount of time in that process. The challenge is, unfortunately, government tends to be less adept at measuring that. So it becomes a little squishier, but it can be done. It absolutely can be done. And a business case should look very much from the government side like it does on the private sector side. Yet we're not manufacturing, so we're not going to have, supply chains of, parts and manufactured inventory sitting there that we have to account for. But we do have things like lots of fleets in our, the public works road crews. They have some pretty expensive equipment. The streets themselves are assets that GASB, Governmental Accounting Standards Board, says we have to put on our books, and we have to track and maintain and take care of that over the life of the asset. That's something the private side doesn't have to worry about, but our system needs to be able to take care of that. So those kinds of things can be very, very, very similar, assuming your organization is able to and willing to do the actual measurements. If not, then it becomes a little bit softer, squishier, if I can use that word. It might not be as, we're going to save 3 staff hours per task on this. It might be, this will make us more efficient. We think we can get, based on some quick sampling, we think we can take 3 steps out of this process and get it done 10% faster. Those are still valid numbers. Conversely, just like on the private sector side, once you've made the investment, you want to follow up and see, are we getting what we thought we were going to get? It's one thing to say we're going to get all of this benefit, but if we don't go back and measure it and say, did we, then you've done half of it, but you haven't proved that this was the best thing to do. Again, it can be more challenging. A lot of it depends on the culture of the organization. Some organizations are not used to doing that for any of their projects, so they're not going to want to do it for an ERP type project. You just have to fit that in. But you can still come back at the end of the implementation and maybe a year later and report back to your budget team, your governing board, whatever that might be, and say, we spent a lot of money. We did this a year ago. This is how it's made us better, faster, cheaper than we used to be.
Yeah, great point. So it's maybe more common than you might think, in terms of the similarities with creating a business case. It's just more a matter of, can you make those squishy, some of those squishy benefits, can you make them a little more tangible and at least be directionally accurate in terms of what the improvements might be.
And that's where partnering with, again, the finance team and the HR team, they're the ones that are in it all day long. They can help you with labor costs and things like that.
I'm here with Ron Puccinelli. We're talking about lessons from government ERP implementations. We've got a lot more to cover, but first we're going to take a quick break. We'll be back with more Transformation Ground Control. My name is Eric Kimberling, and I'm the CEO and founder of Third Stage Consulting. Before we dive too far into today's content, I want to invite you to learn a little bit more about Third Stage Consulting, who we are and what we do. I've included a link to a video right here that describes Third Stage in a bit more detail. It talks about our story, our history, our philosophy, our clients, our service offerings, and that sort of thing. But in general, what Third Stage Consulting does is we're an independent and tech-agnostic consulting provider. We help clients through their entire digital transformation life cycles, beginning with digital strategy, software evaluation and selection, all the way through and including implementation planning, implementation readiness, and the actual implementation itself. We're technology agnostic, so we only represent our clients' best interests. We do not represent software vendors. But having said that, we work very closely with software vendors, all the leading players that you can imagine we've worked with, both in helping clients evaluate and select them, but also in helping clients implement those solutions as well. So we have a very broad, objective, agnostic view of the market that is meant to really represent your interest as you go through your digital transformation. I also encourage you to scan this QR code right here to get access to our resource center. This resource center has a ton of information, ton of ebooks that are free. You have access to top 10 software rankings, playbooks for how to make your project more successful, guides to change management, YouTube videos, all kinds of stuff that are going to help you through your digital transformation. So I encourage you to scan this QR code to get access to those resources. And please feel free to reach out to me directly to brainstorm ideas about your project. Even if it's just informally, you want to bounce around some ideas and get some informal advice, I'd be happy to spend some time with you. So feel free to reach out to me. I've included my contact information below. You can also find it in the description field of this video as well. So this year's Stratosphere in August, we've got an exciting agenda. On day one, it's going to be the welcome reception, a lot of networking. So it's a great way to meet some of the other peers that will be at the event. And then on day two is the full day of packed dual sessions. So there's 2 tracks happening throughout the day. You can pick which sessions you want to go to. And then on day 3, there's a half day of sessions, followed by a VIP lunch for those of you that register for the VIP passes.
The last thing you want to have happen is for your digital transformation to end up in court. I've been doing this for 20 years and I have seen everything. My name is Marcus Harris. I'm a software and technology attorney focusing my practice on drafting and negotiating software-related contracts and litigating software disputes across the country. Feel free to reach out to us at taftlaw.com. We'd love to talk to you about the litigation process and what you can expect.
Hello, welcome back to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 220. My name is Eric Kimberling here with Darian Chwialkowski. I'm here with Ron Puccinelli. We're talking about lessons from government ERP implementations. Well, we have the award for most random question so far in this stream is on YouTube. This is from someone on YouTube that says, "Do you believe in aliens?" And I thought, well, since you work for the government, maybe you know something that we don't, Ron. Would tell us the real story about aliens. What's this Area 51 thing that we should be thinking about?
Don't know about Area 51. I work for a city, not the federal government.
That is true.
But personally, I happen to believe that aliens are real.
Yeah. I mean, you figure, I know we're way off topic here, and that's my fault, but actually, I'll blame the person on YouTube that asked the question. But you think, with an infinite universe, there has to be life on another planet somewhere.
There has to be.
Yeah,
it may not be humanoid, but there's something somewhere.
I mean, I'd love to ask the audience, since we're off topic, drop in the chat. Do aliens exist? Does the government know about it? Maybe Ron knows about it, and he's acting innocent because he works for the city, not the federal government. But kidding aside, the real question I was going to ask you, though, now that I got myself completely sidetracked, this is actually a really interesting question, because I feel like we were just talking about this right before we went live. Ron and I were talking about some of the trials and tribulations of finding his next CIO role, and just sort of what he's looking for and that sort of thing. And this, you might have some strong opinions on this. This is from Jeremy on LinkedIn. Jeremy says, what 3 things would cause you to walk away from running a technology project in government? So if you were, especially now, as you're looking at these different organizations, you might become the next CIO or leader of, what are the things that would scare you away? Maybe some of them already have scared you away. I don't know. But what are 3 things some examples of things you might see, or red flags you might observe that that might tell you that, hey, I don't want to be part of this. I don't think it's going to be successful.
Great question. For me, it comes down to basic, the project management body of knowledge is, if you're having a difficulty getting traction, if you don't have an engaged sponsor, if requirements are continuously changing throughout the life of a project, you have a lot of staff turnover, particularly at senior level, executive level type positions. Those are all things that would tend to say, maybe we need to pump the brakes on this. Maybe we need to reevaluate. I would say, if you're coming into a project, you've got, these typically run 18 to 24 months. If you're coming up on month 26, 28, and you still haven't gone live with at least part of your system, why are we spending more money on something that looks like it's never going to finish? Let's understand what finished looks like. You should do that up front, of course. But let's make sure we all agree on what finished looks like, and let's get to where we're using the system before we start spending more money on refining. And otherwise, you just end up chasing your tail, and you never actually get anywhere.
Right.
I think those are the main things. Is if the requirements continue to change, or they're not clear, you're having a huge amount of turnover, particularly at the executive level, your sponsor level. Those are some of the flags that would say, this might not be the right time to do this. The other piece I would say is, prior to solicitation, and you're looking at your technical environment, if your technical environment can't deliver the features and functionality, the speeds, the system capacities that you need to do this project, make sure you have your technical foundation solid before you try and build on top of that. It's kind of like trying to hang curtains on windows that the foundation hasn't been built for yet.
Right. It's good. It's a good analogy or metaphor. That's a great point. Here's a comment from Joe on YouTube. Bro, spitting facts. I have 2 teenage boys, and so I know enough to know that that's a compliment. So, bro, you're spitting facts, Ron. I don't know about you, but I love.
Thank you.
I love when people call me bro. Like, I feel so young. Like, oh wow, I'm bro worthy. Yep. That's cool. Here's a question from Troy, just building on this whole business case thread that we were just talking about. So Troy on LinkedIn says, related to the question about tracking metrics in the government sector versus private sector, what metrics are most important to you? Which ones are you tracking the most throughout a project?
Excellent question. And oddly enough, they're very, very similar, whether you're in the government side or in the private side, at least in my experience. We're tracking things like, are we on time to our project plan? Do we have the engagement from the project team, from the sponsor team? Are we delivering the value that we expected to deliver? And that comes back to your business case. Why are we doing this? Where are we in getting towards getting that done? And then at the end, after the implementation, did we meet those objectives of value that we thought we were going to get? It's never going to be 100% because just like, budgets or any other sort of strategic planning activity, it's your best guess about what's going to be in the future. And unfortunately, most of us don't know what the future looks like. So we say we think it's going to be a 10% savings reduction. After implementation, if we got 8%, we say, hey, that's not too bad. If it's 2%, then we need to do a little bit more work on getting what we thought we were going to get.
Yeah, super, super interesting. Now, one thing I didn't ask you earlier that I probably should have asked you sooner is just when you look at your last two projects at City of Fairfield and City of Menifee in California, what system or systems were you deploying in those two cases?
In both of those cases, we went through our selection process, we ended up going with Tyler Technologies' government-specific ERP system. Both of those cities are relatively small. We're not a San Francisco, Los Angeles, and New York or something like that would use an SAP or a PeopleSoft or your larger systems. I've done those systems in government as well as private, but those ones we ended up going with the Tyler Technologies one just because it was really much more focused on government. In the case of Menifee, we were actually using an older version of their product, so it was a little bit lower learning curve. Not completely flat, but lower. It's just how the selection process and the people that were going to be using it all day, every day, decided that's the one that was going to be the easiest for them to adopt.
Yeah. Industry specific systems can't be overlooked. There's a lot of good options out there aside from the big household name software vendors. There's a lot of industry niche players that focus on specific needs in industries. Yeah.
Right.
So when you were going through that project, what would you say in those two cases of implementing Tyler Technologies at both City of Menifee and City of Fairfield? What were some of the biggest challenges you faced there that you thought were the hardest part of doing that implementation?
I hate to say this, but in some cases, working with the vendor is the bigger challenge. Not because they can't do it; they absolutely can. But in this particular case, Tyler, they are both the system manufacturer, for lack of a better word, as well as the implementation team. They do not allow third-party implementers. So that's both good and bad. They tend to know the system really well because they wrote the system. The potential downside of that is because they have like 60 or 70% of the government market across the United States, at least. Because of that, their implementation teams are very busy. So you will tend to see a little bit of, you might start with person A in chart of accounts and end up going through person B and C and D in the life of your project. You want to try and minimize that as much as you can, but again, depending on the constraints of your implementing team from the vendor, you might not be able to completely eliminate all of that. I think the other big challenge is remembering that, and this is true regardless of who you go with, the implementations team's focus is on getting to implementation complete. They're not worrying about, do you have time to train your people? Are you taking enough time to make the decisions in the most strategic way about your chart of accounts, about your process re-engineering, those kinds of things? That still is something that the internal implementation team needs to build into the overall project plan. I would push back a bit and say, yes, the vendor team needs to come up with their project plan, but you still need to put your specific steps and things into the overall project plan. And it might be where okay, vendor, your team's going to be done in 6 months. We need to add 2 months for our work to get the chart of accounts straight, to do our process reviews and make sure we've not got steps we don't need, and or we're adding another process. So we need you to go a little bit slower while we take the right amount of time to get that done.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Great point. Here's an interesting question from Perry, or it's actually a comment, but I want to see what you think of this comment, Ron. So Perry on LinkedIn says, I think that any government major technology project needs to go through a business process discovery, reengineering, enterprise architecture, not just tech architecture, to simplify and automate some of the processes before engaging with an ERP evaluation. Is this true, or have you seen this to be true?
It's absolutely true.
Wait, how have you addressed that?
Yes. So in the city of Fairfield, up here in the Bay Area, we actually did that. We intentionally sat down and went through all of our business processes before we even signed the contract with the vendor, and said, are there things we can, how do we make this process better, regardless of which system we're using? How do we make the process itself better? That is super critical, because at the end of the day, you don't want to be, to use an old Gartner term, you don't want to be paving the cow path. You want to be engineering the freeway, to reduce friction, to make things flow as fast and as smoothly and as appropriately as they can. You don't want to give up any of your authorization steps that are required or important to you, but you don't want it to slow down and, go back and forth and back and forth. Anecdotally, I can tell you that in some of these reviews, we find things like, well, this one piece of paper needs to go from the first floor to the second floor to the fifth floor to the ninth floor, back to the first floor. And it makes that loop 3 times and only one person signs it. Nobody does anything with it otherwise. Well, why are we doing all that? Let's just have the one person get what they need. Those kinds of things have nothing to do with your system, but they add delay, they add friction to your business processes. And again, that's getting back to, we want to engineer the most streamlined, efficient process and then automate it, as opposed to just automating a bad process.
Yeah. And that gets overlooked a lot. I think people think that they have to find and deploy the new technology before they can improve their processes. And so many of the process improvements are not necessarily just technology related. A lot of times it's just, you got a kludgy broken process because it's sort of just morphed into this mess of a process that if you just clean it up and, sort of streamline it using what you've got, there's a lot of value you can get in the short term. And it also, from a change management perspective, it sort of incrementally introduces change slowly instead of all at once. One big massive change. It allows you to sort of incrementally adjust to some of these improvements along the way.
Right.
I want to come back to what you're saying. You were talking about Tyler Technologies a moment ago, and I forgot to mention this when you were talking about how you had deployed Tyler Technologies in both cases, City of Menifee and City of Fairfield. But the interesting thing about Tyler Technologies that I think a lot of times people forget about too is a lot of times you think, well, I can either go with a big name ERP system like SAP, Oracle, Microsoft, whatever, or I could go with a niche industry player like a Tyler Technologies, or in most industry verticals that we consult to, there's a lot of different industry players that build solutions just for their individual niche. But the interesting thing about products like Tyler Technologies is that they're sort of like a hybrid of both. They're built on the Microsoft Dynamics platform, but it's very much tailored for the government space. So it's not like you're dealing. So you were talking about how you had to deal with Tyler Technologies because they're the publisher of the software, and they are, but at the same time, it's also built on the Microsoft platform, and so you're getting some of the benefit and some of the the advantages of being part of that Microsoft ecosystem. And it's not just Microsoft. I know Salesforce does the same thing. They open up their platform to third-party developers to do stuff like that. So the reason I bring all this up is that if you're in government, of course, there's Tyler Technologies. There's other systems out there you could look at that might fit your needs specifically. But in other industries too, there's a lot of Microsoft partners, Salesforce partners, even NetSuite is starting to do it, where you've got third-party developers that are creating these very specific solutions on an existing platform. So be sure to look at those hybrid options, I guess is my point there, because there are a lot of good ones out there.
Absolutely. There's no silver bullet that says this is the only way you should do it. you got to find what works best for you in your business and your industry.
Absolutely. Although I will say in the government space, I think, I don't have the data in front of me, but I believe Tyler Technologies is the most common one that we've seen, especially at the city and county level. Once you get up to
in the United States, that's
good
a
point.
true
In the United
statement,
States, yes. And then, at the federal level in the United States, that's different. Usually that's where you're going to see more of the, the bigger players like SAP and Oracle, Workday as
Yep.
well. When you look at the projects you've been through, what's the, I don't know, what's the biggest takeaway or not mistake necessarily? I mean, there's a lot of mistakes to be made in these projects, but what's the biggest mistake or biggest lesson that you've learned from doing these implementations, whether it's for Menifee or Fairfield or in the private sector as well?
As odd as it sounds, I think one thing to remember is no plan ever survives first contact with the enemy, in this case, the
Right.
project. Don't stress on it. Let it, it's going to do what it's going to do. You got to be nimble on your feet. You got to adapt to the changes in the organization, because these are long-term kinds of projects. They're not something you do in a week or two. They're a year and a half, 2, even 3 years long. And you want to be able to adapt the project to the changes in the organization. Nothing's going to be perfectly smooth. You're going to come out of it with some battle scars at the end of the day. The trick is to make sure, to the best of your ability, none of them are fatal. But lessons are going to be learned. And I would say build that into various stages in your project plan as well. Don't be afraid of that, particularly if you're on, for lack of a better word, the steering committee part of the project. You want to make sure that periodically you're taking that look back and saying, where are we running into problems? What can we do to move that out? You got to make that feedback loop happen continuously. But at the end of the day, you don't want to leave dead bodies by the side of the road by burning out your teams. But you also don't want to let the project get derailed and fail. You got to find that balance in between. And it's going to be work. These things are a huge amount of work, a huge amount of change. You just have to be ready to do it.
Absolutely. Just to circle back on the alien thread, Perry on LinkedIn says that we are the aliens on Earth. So I think maybe we've settled the whole are there aliens or do you believe in aliens? Maybe we've settled that whole debate, but I'm guessing probably not. Another quick question. I won't dive too far into this, but I do want to address it. This is from Vast CNC on YouTube. Vast says, where does Palantir enter the picture? LOL. So it's a joke, but actually Palantir is something that's used quite a bit for bigger federal and countrywide government institutions, not only in the US, but it's internationally as well. So Palantir is sort of a middleware BI AI workflow engine that sort of sits on top of legacy systems. So you can get some of the best, some of the best of both worlds, if you will, without having to necessarily replace your back office ERP systems. But the question I want to ask you, just to sort of close out and bring this all full circle now we're on, is what advice would you give to other city CIOs or government leaders or any ERP implementation project leader, even in the private sector? What advice would you give for those leaders that are preparing for an ERP implementation?
Pack your patience.
Yep.
If I could just touch on the Palantir piece for a moment. Part of what you want to do in an ERP system is recognize that it's not going to do everything that your business does. You're going to need those middleware integration points. Make sure you know what those are up front. Even if you're not doing anything with it, just make sure you know what it is you're going to need to do down the road so that you can build that into your system requirements and into your system. I would say if you're an organization looking at considering doing an ERP implementation, or even just a more general digital changeover in your business processes, don't forget to do the important work of defining what is the reason we're doing this. What's the business reason we're doing this? If that's not clear, it's going to be a struggle to get success. Build in time for your organization to understand, to do the organizational change management, for them to understand the what, the why, the how, and as much as you possibly can, get them engaged in defining the how. Through your project teams, through your implementation teams, through your training processes, build in as much of that feedback as you can on. They're the ones doing the work. They know best what they need. Let them help you define and drive all of that. The other thing I would suggest is periodically build in a report back to your governing board. In city cases, it's the city council or the board of supervisors if you're at county level, your board of directors if you're in the private side. Build back a periodic, here's where we are, here are the next things that are happening. We found problems, we've not found problems. Finally, the last thing I think I would add in there is we want to make sure that while we're staying in budget, this is kind of like remodeling a house. You never know what's in the walls until you open them up. You want to build in some contingency in your budgets to handle any of those surprises. Don't use it all in the first 2 weeks of the project either, but you want to be able to handle whatever surprises you find in the process.
Great advice, and surprises are a necessary evil in these sorts of projects, and there's a lot you can do to minimize the amount of surprises you have. But like you said, you talked earlier about doing some of that upfront work to define the way your processes are going to work and that sort of thing. There's a lot of phase 0 planning type stuff you can do to mitigate risk. Obviously, choosing the right technology or technologies that mitigates your risk, but you're never going to fully mitigate or eliminate the surprises in these projects. And so knowing that you've got some buffer in there is important. So it's really important too, not to fall victim to the false hope that I'm using a commercial off the shelf system with best practices. How hard can it be? Or another one we hear a lot is like a lot of CIOs, a lot of executives, especially like CFOs and COOs, people more from the business side. A lot of them will say, well, changes isn't going to be that hard because people hate the systems we have. So they're going to love the new system. And that's might be true, but once you dig in and start screwing up people's jobs and changing it and moving stuff around, it's that who moved my cheese, concept. That's where people start to feel a lot more threatened. So good stuff. Good advice. And I appreciate you being here today and sharing some of your lessons with us. What's the best way to connect with you? Is it LinkedIn? Is that the best place to connect with you?
I'm on LinkedIn. I will accept any request to connect. And I appreciate the opportunity, Eric. This is a lot of fun to talk about this.
All right. Thank you, Ron. And thanks to the audience for the great questions there. A lot of really good stuff we dove into and could have spent a lot more time talking through it. But unfortunately, time was not on our side. But there are some lessons and takeaways we want to debrief on here in just a moment. And then we're also going to talk about the zero-cost digital transformation concept here in just a moment. But first, we're going to take a quick break. We'll be back with more Transformation Ground Control.
Just tell me what you've got to say to me. I've been waiting for so long to hear the truth.
If you are involved in any sort of digital transformation or business change initiative, you will want to download the Digital Transformation Report. With its comprehensive overview of business and technology trends and best practices, this report is a must-have guide for any transformation project or executive team. Download this free report by visiting Third Stage Consulting at thirdstage-consulting.com. You can also visit our website to learn more about us or download independent reports, videos, and other best practices. Again, visit thirdstage-consulting.com today to learn how you can take your transformation to the third stage of success.
Are you looking for ways to promote your product or service to enterprise technology decision makers and influencers throughout the world, like the ones who listen to this podcast? Major Tom Productions creates media, events, and influencer marketing for B2B technology providers. Our productions are exciting, educational, disruptive, and effective. Most importantly, they create results. Our content is unlike any other in this industry, engaging, influential, and trusted by technology buyers and influencers throughout the world. Each month, our productions reach hundreds of thousands of targeted buyers and decision makers who trust and engage with our honest and tech-agnostic content. With long-tail viral results and engagement with our content, Major Tom Productions provides a way to reach your target market and create awareness, calls to action, and a connection with potential customers. So, collaborate with us today. Learn how we can feature your product or service on podcasts such as Transformation Ground Control, Journey to S/4HANA, and Journey to Dynamics 365. We can also feature your brand on our YouTube channel called Digital Transformation with Eric Kimberling, which boasts over 100,000 subscribers and over 2 million video views per year. You can also participate in our in-person events, including our Digital Stratosphere Conference. Contact us today to learn more. We can tailor a marketing campaign that works for you. We look forward to helping more people learn more about and become engaged with your brand.
Hello, welcome back to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 220. My name is Eric Kimberling here with Darian Chwialkowski. You can find new episodes of this show every Wednesday by going to transformationgroundcontrol.com. The show is sponsored by Third Stage Consulting, an independent consulting firm that I'm not coincidentally happen to be the CEO of. And we are an independent tech-agnostic consulting firm that helps clients throughout the world with their digital transformation journeys. So, Darian, we just had Ron on the show talking about government ERP implementations. It's a topic we don't talk about a lot on the show. We talk about ERP implementation best practices and lessons a lot, but never. It's been a while since we've talked about public sector types of implementations. What were some of your thoughts and takeaways from the conversation?
Yeah, I thought it was a great conversation overall. You gave a lot of really good insight. Definitely want to expand on some of the different talking points that you guys were talking about. One in particular that I found interesting, which was the list of kind of the top red flags, such as sponsor disengagement, changing requirements, and staff turnover. And kind of compared that to late stage ERP project with no go live to chasing your tail in a way. One question with this, if you are already mid project and you spot these warning signs, what do you do first to try to course correct before considering completely walking away from the project?
That's a good question. We actually get a lot of work, not in the case of Ron. He was not one of our clients that hired us for this particular service, but we do a lot of service. A lot of our services are focused on project recoveries and really assessing troubled projects. In some cases, they're completely failed. In some even more extreme cases, they failed and they're in a lawsuit litigation, and we'll be an expert witness for those cases. So we've seen the whole spectrum, the whole continuum of starting a project from the beginning and getting to do it right. Not perfect, but doing it right. And then there's midstream projects where we get involved because someone tried to do it, didn't go well, got off track, and we'll come in and fix it. And then there's some that have completely failed, and then we'll either help in court or help recover the project. So in all those cases, though, what we find is there's a couple different avenues. I mean, one is sometimes projects are such a mess that it makes sense for them to call a timeout, just pause the entire project because you're just wasting money. You're going in the completely wrong direction. Just pause and reset, reset the plan, recast the plan, revisit the strategy because something's not working. In other cases, if it's a less extreme failure or if it's not quite as dire, it might be like, hey, we're having some pretty significant road blocks here and pitfalls. We need to pivot here and there. And we'll do the assessment of the project in parallel. So you kind of let the project continue, but we're working side by side with the client to identify where they should be fine tuning and pivoting and getting it back on track. So it really depends on where, how extreme the mess is. And that's part of what clients will ask us sometimes. They'll say, hey, should we stop the project? Should we keep going? I mean, what I always say is that, like, the easy preferred answer is keep the project going and then do, sort of have support from a company like ours in parallel where we can help you pivot and recast and tweak and all that stuff. But if for some reason the project is such a mess and it's really bad, then there are times where we have said, you've got to just stop this project. I mean, call a timeout and just completely recast the plan. So a lot of times clients know coming in what they want. Other times they ask us what we think, but that's the general criteria. It's not a hard and fast scientific rule, but you usually when we go in and within a week or two, usually we can tell like, okay, yeah, this is one that should pause, or this is one where there's some significant issues, but we can keep things rolling. There's a lot of value being done, not perfectly, but we can improve a lot of things, but we can not cause the disruption of stopping it. Because once you stop a project, it's just really disruptive. I mean, people lose faith in the project internally. Your software vendor oftentimes will have to staff their resources on other projects because they can't wait around for you to restart it. So you're probably going to lose a good portion of your project team externally too. So that's why the threshold's pretty high. It has to be pretty screwed up for you to get to that point. But if it's bad enough, then it could make sense to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. And another thing I found really interesting was kind of something that we don't talk about very often, which is Tyler Technologies versus the classic big ERP vendors. So
yeah,
some things you guys mentioned was at the city and county level in the US, Tyler is more common, while at the federal level, it's more often SAP or Oracle.
Right.
When evaluating between a niche vendor like Tyler and a tier one system, what should a public sector team weigh most heavily in that decision?
Yeah, good question. Well, I think Ron hit on a lot of what you'd want to look at in terms of, functional fit for sure. If it's a system that can't do fund accounting, like you talked about fund accounting a few times in that conversation, if you can't do fund accounting and you're a government entity, then it's probably not a good fit. And it's probably not going to be enough to say, well, we'll just customize, one of the systems to do that. It's such a core part of your business. If you're a government entity, that you don't want to be customizing that if you can help it. The other thing I'd say though is, look at your entire spectrum of options, because you do have SAP, you have Oracle, you have Workday, which is commonly used in that space. We see, there's other systems like Unit 4 and some others, Palantir, other systems that we see in the public sector more often than others. But I think the thing with Tyler Technologies and the thing, sort of the message to people in the public sector and individual niches in the private sector too, is that there are options that are sort of like hybrids of, like the Tyler Technologies, where it's built on a common platform, a well-established platform, but it's very tailored for your specific niche. And in their case, they built it on Microsoft Dynamics, which obviously Microsoft is a very well-established platform, and they've just taken that platform and extended it or tailored it for a specific industry niche. And there's a lot of Microsoft. One of the strengths of Microsoft is its ecosystem of third-party developers that will do that have created industry or functionally specific solutions. So I think just understanding that you have all these different options out there, whether you're public sector or anywhere in the private sector too, is just an important thing to keep in mind.
Yeah, absolutely. And last kind of point here, I think Ron said his number one piece of advice was kind of to pack your patience and build organizational change management into every phase of the project. Eric, from your perspective, if a CIO or executive team is preparing for a transformation in the next 6 to 12 months, what's one mindset shift they should embrace to have the best chance at success?
I always start with realistic expectations, and sort of packed within that is having a healthy dose of skepticism. Be a little bit paranoid, because I think that helps as a leader of transformation. You have to be paranoid and question things that sound easy. Anytime you hear something like best practices or pre-configured solutions or 100% user adoption rates, don't get fooled into thinking that that's true, first of all. And second of all, don't get fooled into thinking that somehow you've just mitigated all your risk. And so I think just being paranoid and looking for risks and just being diligent about finding the risks and the trade-offs and really thinking through both sides of any decision you make, that's part of that realistic expectations. Like these projects are difficult and there is no good answer in a lot of cases. You're just choosing the lesser of two evils on a lot of decisions you have to make in these projects. So I think just having that right mindset is really important.
Yeah, absolutely. It was a great conversation with Ron overall. I felt that it was a little bit of a switch up from our usual topic. So that was some great insights for sure.
Yeah, it was good. It was interesting. So it's good to have him on the show, and hopefully we'll have him back as he gets more and more experience under his belt. And thanks to the audience for the great questions as well. Well, good. We're going to shift gears and get into a zero cost digital transformation. Is that possible? Are we crazy? Speaking of too good to be true, it is too good to be true, by the way. Spoiler alert, there's no such thing as a free digital transformation, but there are such a thing as not blowing a bunch of money on your digital transformation and doing a very cost-effective, low-cost, and in some cases, yes, you can do it for little to no cost. I mean, it depends on what you mean by digital transformation. Now, a full transformation, of course, is going to cost money if you're talking about implementing new, cloud solutions and AI capabilities, things like that. But there's a lot of things organizations can be doing that are no cost, little cost to no cost. And that's really what we want to talk about here in the next segment. So let's roll the clip and we'll come back and chat about it. For the last 25 years, I've been working with clients and helping them through their digital transformations. One of the most common challenges that they have is that these projects cost way too much money. They spend too much. They don't plan to spend as much as they do. And ultimately, the budgets run way over what they ultimately expect. And to be honest, cloud software, today's technology, modern technologies cost a lot of money. If you're investing in new technology, it's going to cost you an arm and a leg to invest in that money. And many of you are not in a position where you can necessarily budget for that. And to add insult to injury, a lot of software vendors are forcing a migration to new cloud solutions that are going to cost you more money in the long term. So the question becomes, how can we go through a transformation without spending all this money and without redirecting resources and money that could be spent elsewhere? How can we do that in a way that's cost effective to allow us to free up cash and resources to invest elsewhere? And that's what I want to talk about here today. If you'd like to learn more about digital transformation strategies and best practices and general software reviews and independent rankings of different solutions in the marketplace, I encourage you to download our 2025 Digital Transformation Report. It's a report we publish each year, and it contains a number of best practices that will help you through your transformation. You can download that for free on our website by scanning the QR code right here, or you can go to the links below. The first thing to consider when you're evaluating this $0 or free transformation that I'm talking about here today is to consider the fact that the traditional enterprise technology model isn't working. For decades now, organizations have been spending way too much money on their transformations. They've been over-investing in technology, and they've been investing in shelfware or software that just sits there that they're not using or getting value out of. And there's so many projects out there where they get into such trouble that they pull the plug on the project and ultimately decide that they're going to scrap the project altogether. There's just a lot of wasted money and inefficiency in these digital transformations. And that's something that has to change, especially nowadays where you're committing and signing up for a cloud-based subscription where you're going to be paying these monthly and annual fees into perpetuity, whether you get value out of the technology or not. So that's the danger of going through the traditional enterprise technology and ERP implementation approach. And what we are seeing today is that there's too many organizations that are just spending way too much money on these projects. You look at these big, massive failures where they spend tens or maybe even hundreds of millions of dollars on their implementations, and many of them don't have any value to show for it. Many of them have operational disruption and they're not able to ship product or run payroll or close the books. There's a lot of issues that come out of these traditional enterprise tech projects. So we need to be looking more at not only how can we mitigate risk and ensure that we're not putting our operations in jeopardy, but also how can we ensure that we're not overspending on technology and overspending on our implementation. And software vendors and system integrators for years have been enjoying the fact that organizations are spending too much time and money on these projects. So now may be a good time for organizations to consider the way they approach enterprise technology investments. Another challenge with traditional and historical enterprise technology projects and digital transformations is that organizations spend way too much money on the technology and they underinvest in the more important factors such as people and processes and strategy. This is understandable because most organizations can look and see and touch and feel an actual software system. So they feel like when they invest in that technology, that's where the money should go and where the resources and effort should go. But in reality, the real differentiator, the real thing that's going to make a project successful has nothing to do with the technology. It has more to do with the organizational change, the operational improvements, the overall strategy alignment, and just the overall low-hanging fruit that comes with any sort of digital transformation. But organizations instead spend way too much money investing in these technologies that don't deliver any real business value. And so what we need to do is look at how can we redeploy resources away from technology, which is the more expensive part of a project, delivering much less value, but how can we redirect those resources, time, money, and budgets into the things that will actually make you successful in your transformation and deliver the low-hanging fruit and the ROI you're looking for. And if you redeploy the resources away from technology into your processes and people, your chances are much higher of achieving actual business value and a positive ROI and a successful project than if you were to overinvest in technology and get bogged down by all the technical complexities that come with a new modern ERP system or a new modern technology that you might be deploying. Now, I'm not suggesting you ignore technology altogether, but what I am suggesting is that you can probably throttle back a lot of that spending that's so expensive for organizations and redirect that money towards the organizational change piece of it and the business process improvement piece of it. And when you look at just those two pieces, you're likely to find a lot of low-hanging fruit that's going to deliver a lot of business value, a lot of improvements, even without investing in new technologies. So one way to look at this is to say, how can we improve our business with low-hanging fruit by not necessarily over-investing in new technologies, but instead, how can we change our processes, change our roles and responsibilities, change the way people operate, use lower-cost technologies to enable improvements to the business? How can we do that instead of investing in these big, massive, bloated ERP and enterprise-wide technology solutions? And organizations that invest wisely in the business and people side of things are the ones that are much more successful than the ones that over-invest in technologies, because the ones that over-invest in technologies typically get bogged down by all the technical stuff that really doesn't matter at the end of the day and doesn't materially impact or improve your business. When we're working with organizations that come to us and say, hey, third stage consulting team, we want you to guide us through a digital transformation, one of the first questions we ask is why? Why do you want to go through a digital transformation? And a lot of times we get very vague or nebulous answers around how the software vendor is forcing us to upgrade, or our system is outdated, or we don't have anyone that can support this technology because it's homegrown and the person that developed it is retired and they're long gone. And there's a lot of reasons like that that lead organizations to digital transformations. But when we really peel back the onion and dig into an organization, we oftentimes find that they have a lot of tools and technologies and resources that are underutilized, that if they just figured out how to make better use of those resources and tools, they might get immediate business value with a very low risk and very low investment. For example, a lot of organizations have shelfware that's just been sitting there for years. They've got modules that they've never used. They've got departments that have never fully adopted the technology they have. They've never fully integrated the core ERP system to other legacy systems. All these different things you look at in the landscape oftentimes lead you to the conclusion that the organization has totally underutilized the technologies and tools that they have. And this is just based on legacy technologies. Even organizations that invested in ERP systems 5, 10, 20 years ago, oftentimes will find that they've got modules they never decided to use. They've got people that are working outside the system. If they just would work within the system, they could get immediate business value. And then you fast forward to today's day and age where most organizations are using Office 365 or some other sort of office-based productivity tool that includes AI mechanisms that might be things that they're already paying for. And these are tools that they could be using to immediately add business value to improve their business processes and make people more efficient. For example, you look at Microsoft's Copilot. There's so many organizations we work with where they are already investing in and paying for Microsoft's Copilot. Sometimes they don't even know it, sometimes they do, but many times, most of the time, they don't even realize there's a lot of business value they could be getting out of Copilot. If they just figured out how to redesign business processes, redesign people's jobs, and educate people on how to use that product, that can deliver immediate business value at no cost, no incremental additional cost than what's already been invested in the organization. So this is why it's so important for organizations to really take a step back and not be too pressured by software vendors to invest in new technologies when they haven't even fully taken advantage of the technologies and tools they already have. So that's one thing you could do, is really look at what are some of these incremental improvements you can make, and what are some of the improvements you can make with the existing tool set you have, and how can we optimize and improve the tool sets that you already have and you've already paid for, And that's another way that you can get away with going through a digital transformation without really paying the high price tag that most digital transformations experience. Another thing to remember is that you can start slow and you can spend more money later. So often, software vendors and their sales reps will offer you the sun, moon, and the stars. They'll try to sell you everything, and they'll try to convince you that investing in their complete suite of products is going to completely transform your business, completely make life easier, and provide a silver bullet to get you to the next level that you're trying to achieve for your business. Now, in some cases, that's true, but in most cases, what we find is that organizations are being oversold. They're being sold too much software they're never going to use, they can't consume it. The organizations are so far behind technologically and in their maturity level, whereas software vendors are so far ahead of where most organizations are, that it's just a waste of money for them to overinvest in these advanced emerging technologies that they can't use, especially for organizations that are still using old legacy homegrown mainframe systems, for example. To go from that environment to a fully cloud-based environment with AI tools and all these advanced features, that's a huge jump, and it's probably not likely for most organizations. So instead, what we need to do is look at how can we start slow and slowly invest in new technologies, new tool sets, new improvements, new process optimizations, new organizational changes, and start to get some momentum behind the project, and then realize that you can always spend more money later. But once you invest and commit to a cloud-based solution, an AI tool, whatever the tool set is, you're committed. You're paying that money regardless of whether or not you're getting the business value out of it. So organizations need to focus more on how can we start slow and get some immediate value, some immediate ROI, and then you can always spend more money later. And I always look forward to meeting that client, which I've not yet met yet, but I'm looking forward to meeting that client that says, you know what, we invested too slow. We wish we would have been more aggressive because we're so good at digital transformation and we're so good at adapting these tools into our operations that we should have started sooner. I've yet to hear that. Most clients are on the opposite side of the spectrum. They overinvested, they wasted money, and they wish they wouldn't have. So the good news is if you start slow, you can always invest later. But if you invest too much early on and waste that money early on, there's no getting out of it. So you might as well start slow, and if you need to, you can speed up later. Now, it's important to remember that the biggest operational improvements for most organizations don't necessarily require new technologies. You look at the inefficiencies that you have within your organization. Think about the manual spreadsheets and the rework and the broken processes that your organization and your team is facing right now. Chances are pretty high that there might be a technological component to that, but chances are also pretty high that it might just be that people weren't trained on the appropriate process. Maybe they weren't using the software appropriately. Maybe there's shelfware that you've invested in, but you're not using, or you haven't rolled it out to your broader community. There's so many low-hanging fruit, low-cost types of things that organizations could do just to take advantage of what they already have. And when you look at these business process and organizational improvements, chances are pretty high that those improvements are going to deliver a lot more business value than trying to slam in or force in a brand new technology that completely disrupts and changes your business. Now, long-term, it may be something you need to do. Longer term, yes, maybe you need to invest more aggressively in new technology because your technology stack is so outdated. You've got the technical debt, all that stuff. That's the kind of stuff that software vendors and industry analysts will convince you or try to convince you of, is that you've got technical debt, you need to invest. But the reality is the most immediate value and the biggest improvements are likely going to come from process and people changes, not necessarily the technology. And getting back to my previous point, you can always invest more in technology later, but once you've committed to a cloud-based subscription and a broad tool set of ERP or AI or whatever the tool set is, you're pretty well locked in and committed to that, and it's going to cost you a lot of money, whether you get the business value or not. So you might as well focus on the things that are going to deliver more immediate business value and give you a better ROI, and get those things out of the way first. So the strategies I've shared with you today are designed to give you some options to go through a transformation without necessarily over-investing in new technology. In fact, a lot of the things I've suggested here today will cost you very little to nothing to go through the process. Now, of course, it'll cost you time, it'll cost you focus, but it's going to avoid that big, massive price tag that sinks a lot of companies. And a lot of companies go bankrupt because they spend too much money on technology, and those projects are such a disaster and so disruptive to the organization that they end up in real trouble. And so what I'm sharing with you here today is a more incremental, low risk, high value type of approach that you can go down to maybe not have a completely free digital transformation, but one that's certainly going to cost you exponentially less than the average organization that spends way too much time and money on a project with very little to show for it. All right, so that was a clip from my YouTube channel where I talk about the zero cost digital transformation. What were some of your thoughts and takeaways from that, Darian?
Yeah, super interesting. It was a great video for sure. Some follow-up questions though for it. One of the things that you said was that the biggest improvements usually come from fixing people and process issues, not just buying more and more tech to fix those issues. Why do you think leadership teams still fall into the new tech will save us trap instead of fixing kind of what's broken first and then not having to invest so much money in tech, I guess?
Well, I think a lot of times what happens is the software vendors themselves sort of force organizations to gloss over the fact that they're not getting business value or they haven't optimized business value. Because if you think about it, it's a constant cycle of upgrades and improvements and enhancements to the technology. And the technology changes so fast and is so far ahead of most organizations that the organizations never catch up to where the vendor is. So it's a constant game of catch up, and you're dealing with legacy systems that are getting sunset. And so it's almost like organizations just don't have time a lot of times to optimize. And what I'd say to that though is to rethink the tempo of your pace of change technologically within your organization, because you don't have to be on the most modern ERP system. In fact, it's riskier in many cases for a lot of organizations to be on the most recent version of a technology, partially because it's more expensive, partially because it's less proven and less mature in many cases, and partially because it's going to cause disruption to your business. And it might be good disruption in the long term, but in the short term, it's going to cause negative disruption. So you look at all those factors and you say, okay, well, what's the right tempo for us? We know that vendors off here way, light years ahead of us developing new stuff, and that's their job. That's great. Let them do it. Doesn't mean you as a business need to do that. It could mean that, you have limited resources. Some of that's going to go to technology, but a lot of it probably needs to go somewhere else to new, capital investments in buildings or factories or hiring people, whatever. Lots of stuff, lots of ways you could be spending your money. So you have to look at that and say, well, where am I going to get the most value? Maybe I don't have enough of a priority on all the technology in the world. So let's figure out how to get more out of what we've got. So I think that's part of it. We have a client that we're working with now it's a big company that is on SAP, and they had been through a multi-year rollout of ECC, which is the legacy, the older SAP product that's been replaced by S/4HANA. So they had just finished their multi-year rollout of ECC that went on for several years. They just finished it, I think, 2 years ago. And they're already being told by SAP now they've got to upgrade to S/4HANA, just like most ECC customers are. But the CIO in this case and the CFO that I talked to were very frustrated because they said, we just finished implementing ECC. We haven't even gotten the business value yet. We haven't even optimized and fine-tuned it yet. And SAP is already telling us we need to move off it onto a new platform. And so that's a great example, use case or a case study of how organizations fall into the trap you just described or that you just asked about. It's because they don't have time to optimize. In this case, I think what they'll probably end up doing is saying, well, we're going to hold off on S/4HANA until we get proven value out of ECC and stabilize our operations and get everything where we want it. Then we'll think about an S/4HANA upgrade. So I think setting your own tempo, it's your business. Do what you want. I mean, you can follow the tech vendor's roadmap, but you can follow it and keep track of it, but you don't need to follow it prescriptively.
For sure. And I know you kind of touched on this, but what is a realistic first steps for companies that want to start small without getting pressured into a giant multi-year ERP project? So kind of like you said, I know you said it's your business, you have control over it, but is there any other realistic steps that they need to take?
Yeah, what oftentimes we do is we'll look at a business client of ours and we'll say, tell us about your strategy and objectives as a company. And you start there with what are you doing? Who are you right now as a company? And what are you focused on and where are you headed? That oftentimes will lead you towards specific parts of your business that need the most help or could benefit the most from technology. For example, if it's a company that's got private equity investment and all the PE partner cares about is top line revenue growth, well, that's probably a good use case or a good business case for a CRM system that helps enable more sales automation and more sales efficiency. If it's a big global company that just went out and bought a bunch of companies, they've grown through mergers and acquisitions, and now they've got disparate operations throughout the world, It may be that their priority is to standardize and drive efficiency from, to get value out of those efficiency gains. And that might be more of a candidate for a traditional ERP system. So, I think, and now to be fair, that traditional ERP system that's the exact opposite of a zero cost digital transformation. But in their case, that's their strategy, and that's might be what makes sense for them. In the PE owned example I gave, it might be that a more targeted, smaller cost CRM enhancement or upgrade is going to deliver the most value. So I would start there with what your strategy and objectives are, and then get into where operationally are the most pains and opportunity for improvement. And let's start there and go after the low hanging fruit rather than trying to change everything all at once.
Yeah, absolutely. One last question. If a company wants to find some quick, no cost wins today, where should they start looking? What are kind of the easiest places to find this free transformation opportunity?
Well, if I were looking for a free transformation opportunity and I was looking for it quickly, I would do a quick flyover of all my business processes, just the current state, what we're doing today, where the pains are, what technologies we're using. And usually by going through that exercise, you can quickly identify pockets within the company that could use targeted solutions that are going to deliver a huge amount of value. So I would start with understanding your current state operations, as well as quantifying what's being wasted. What's the negative business value that you're getting from your current operations, and what could that business value be if you put in new technology. So start with your current state, look at the business case, and look at the quick ROI, the quickest hit ROI type areas. And that's where I'd start.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, great episode. I like the YouTube video. It was a good mix up, and also so was the interview. So great episode overall.
Yeah, it was fun. Hopefully the audience enjoyed it as well. Thank you, Darian, for another great show. Thanks to Ron for being here, and thank you to the guests, the audience team members for all the great questions here throughout the episode. We'll have a new episode next week. Every Wednesday, new episodes come out. Be sure to check that out. Go to transformationgroundcontrol.com to keep up with all the episodes. Be sure to follow us on social media as well to keep up to date with all the content we're cranking out on a daily basis. In the meantime, hope you have a great day, and we will see you all soon. Take care.